What if I told you a black nurse, just trying to pick up her prescription after a long shift, was arrested, humiliated, and thrown in jail for a crime she didn't commit, all because of the color of her skin? But what the cops didn't know was who she really was, because the moment they put those cuffs on her, they lit a fire that would shake their entire department to its core. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, justice isn't just served, it's unleashed. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. It was supposed to be just another stop on the way home. A routine errand in the fading light of a quiet Thursday evening in Boulder, Colorado. The kind of night that slips past unnoticed until something cracks beneath the surface and reveals the rot underneath. Dr. Lorraine Bishop, 52, a black pediatrician known across the city for her calm wisdom and tireless advocacy for children's health, had just finished a 14-hour shift at the hospital. Her scrubs were exchanged for a casual navy blouse and jeans, her tired eyes hidden behind wireframe glasses. She was worn thin, but resolved, as always. The pharmacy parking lot was dimly lit, the kind of place that usually feels safe until you're standing alone in it. The Colorado air was crisp, the breeze brushing against Lorraine's face as she walked toward the automatic doors, purse in hand, prescription slip tucked neatly inside. She wasn't thinking about injustice. She wasn't thinking about race. She was just thinking about getting her blood pressure medication and heading home to finally rest. Inside, the clerk behind the counter was distracted, eyes darting between Lorraine and the screen. Something about the delay didn't feel quite right. The minutes dragged. Whispers passed between the teenager and a manager with sharp features and a colder stare. Lorraine could feel it, the shift in energy, the familiar, choking tension she had learned to recognize without anyone needing to say a word. It's something you can't explain to someone who's never lived it. The way the air thickens when suspicion is drawn toward your skin before your words even leave your mouth. It wasn't new to Lorraine, but it didn't make it any less violating. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's an issue with your insurance details," the manager said, her voice overly polite, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Lorraine frowned, calm but firm. "That's not possible. I've filled this prescription here for years. Please double check." But the manager was already dialing a number on the phone behind the counter. Lorraine watched, a cold weight building in her stomach. Then came the words that changed everything. "We've called the authorities to verify this situation." Authorities. That one word slammed into her like a wave of ice. She could have left. She could have demanded her documents back and walked away. But Lorraine knew exactly how that would look. To them, retreat was guilt. To them, defiance was threat. She stayed. She stood still. 10 minutes later, the glass doors opened, and two Boulder police officers stepped inside. Both white. Both walking with the casual arrogance of men who expected the world to part at their command. One, Sergeant Blake Monroe, had a reputation Lorraine had heard whispered about in hospital break rooms. Short temper, long leash, The other, Officer Jordan Reese, younger, quieter, but always at Monroe's side like a shadow. The manager barely waited for them to approach before pointing. That's her. Tried to use someone else's insurance. Possibly identity fraud. Neither officer asked to see her ID. Neither asked a single question. Monroe stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his baton, his voice hard-edged. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside." Lorraine's voice remained calm. "I have my ID. I have my insurance card. I have everything you need to confirm who I am." "Step outside," Monroe repeated, the menace in his voice no longer disguised. And when she didn't move quickly enough, he grabbed her wrist. The gasp that came from a customer in the back of the store was the only acknowledgement that something might be wrong. But by then, it didn't matter. Monroe's grip tightened. The cuffs snapped around Lorraine's wrists with a sharp click, and everything else faded into noise. A cell phone camera emerged from someone's pocket, shaky but focused. The red light blinked. A woman's voice, off-screen, whispered, "She didn't do anything." But Monroe wasn't interested in that. He hauled Lorraine toward the exit like a trophy, not a person. Her glasses slipped down her nose. Her bag fell to the ground. And still, she said nothing. She didn't resist, because she knew. She knew that her survival depended on silence. Outside, the cold air slapped against her skin, but the burning in her chest drowned it out. In the squad car, she sat stiffly, her body aching not just from the tightness of the cuffs, but from the sting of humiliation. The flashing lights danced across the windshield, their false sense of urgency mocking the reality of what was happening. Back at the station, Monroe didn't even pretend to follow procedure. Booking her without verifying the ID she had offered, fingerprinting her without charges, pushing her through a system that had already decided her guilt. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that Lorraine Bishop wasn't just any black woman. And she wasn't alone. Her son, Elijah Rivers, wasn't just a concerned relative. He was a civil rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling racist institutions from the inside. And when his phone buzzed at 8:47 p.m. with a panicked voicemail from a pharmacist who had seen everything, the storm they had unwittingly summoned began to form. It started with a phone call, then another, and another. By the time Monroe returned to gloat outside Lorraine's holding cell, laughing lowly with Officer Reese about one more fraud case off the street, the first tremor had already hit. A contact from the DOJ called the Boulder police chief. A reporter with a viral social media presence was on the phone with Lorraine's hospital administrator. And in Washington, D.C., Elijah Rivers was preparing a list of names. Because this time, they didn't just arrest the wrong woman. They arrested the mother of a man who knew exactly how to turn injustice into ammunition. And he was coming for them. Not in months. Not in weeks. Tonight. And it would be the last night Sergeant Monroe ever wore a badge without consequence. Elijah Rivers hadn't planned on working late that night. He had just returned home from a legal conference in Chicago, and all he wanted was a moment of silence, maybe a warm meal, and the familiar hum of his apartment. But justice, he knew too well, rarely respected personal schedules. When he played the voicemail from a woman named Miranda, an off-duty pharmacy technician who'd quietly slipped out of the store after witnessing the arrest, everything inside him went still. "She didn't do anything," Miranda had whispered. "Your mom." They arrested her like she was a threat. No one listened to her. Please, I don't know who else to call. For a moment, Elijah couldn't breathe. Then the instinct that had carried him through federal courtrooms, civil rights trials, and countless pro bono battles kicked in like muscle memory. Within minutes, his laptop was open. Calls were going out. Contacts from the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the Department of Justice were looped in. He moved like a man possessed, not by rage, but by purpose. Elijah wasn't just a lawyer. He was a tactician, and they had just declared war on the wrong family. Injustice had always been a shadow in Elijah's life. His mother, Lorraine Bishop, had raised him to understand the balance between dignity and resistance. She taught him that silence was never submission, but strategy. That survival was not surrender, but preparation. And now, every lesson she had poured into him returned with brutal clarity. He knew the system. He knew how quickly it could twist narratives, bury truths, and criminalize the innocent. But this time, he had more than just a legal degree and a courtroom voice. He had evidence. By 10:13 p.m., the security footage from the pharmacy had been secured. A clerk named Jonah had emailed a copy to Elijah from a burner account. The video was grainy, but it was enough. Lorraine calmly handing over her ID, the manager whispering to the officers, Monroe's aggressive approach, her hands raised, her demeanor respectful, unwavering, and still, the cuffs. Elijah's jaw tightened as he watched it all unfold. He didn't let the fury show on his face. He couldn't afford to. Instead, he drafted a formal complaint and submitted it to the DOJ. Then another, to the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. He attached statements from Miranda and Jonah and looped in 3 reporters who had covered wrongful arrest cases across the state. And then he made the call that would tilt the scales. His mentor, retired federal judge Charles Winslow, picked up on the second ring. Elijah, the judge said, I was just reading that paper you submitted on judicial overreach. I need more than edits tonight, sir, Elijah replied. Boulder PD just made the mistake of their lives. They arrested Lorraine. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, the soft intake of breath. What do you need me to do? Elijah didn't hesitate. Leverage. I need access to DOJ oversight files, and I need you to put in a quiet word with Director Mendelson. Judge Winslow didn't ask why. He simply said, consider it done. By midnight, things were already shifting. Quietly. Powerfully. The Boulder PD's internal line rang unanswered for several minutes. The police chief, Gerald McCain, was suddenly flooded with press requests asking for comment on an unlawful detainment. His assistant, visibly shaken, knocked on his office door and stammered something about the Washington Post requesting an interview about a wrongful arrest involving a prominent medical professional. Inside her holding cell, Lorraine sat still, spine straight, her fingers wrapped gently around the cuffs that still dug into her skin. She had refused to let them see her discomfort, but her thoughts churned. She wasn't afraid. Not really. But she had questions. Would Elijah find out? Would anyone believe her story if he didn't? Then the first sign came. An officer. Someone unfamiliar. Someone who didn't walk with the swagger of Monroe or the silent obedience of Reese, approached her cell and quietly slid her a bottle of water. No words. No small talk. Just a subtle glance, like he knew something was coming. And it was. Elijah had contacted attorney Nyla Reyes, a civil rights firebrand who had once dismantled an entire precinct's internal affairs unit over buried misconduct cases. She had been waiting for a moment like this. With her sharp suit and sharper instincts, she took one look at the footage Elijah had secured and said, "We're going to bury them in truth." By the time Monroe strutted past Lorraine's cell again, smirking as if he still controlled the narrative, a federal case file was already being assembled with his name highlighted across 3 sections. Outside, the night air was thick with anticipation. Protesters were beginning to gather near the station. The video had started to spread. Activist groups shared it. Comments poured in. She didn't do anything. Why is this still happening? Where's the justice for Lorraine Bishop? By 2:35 a.m., Officer Monroe's internal affairs file had been accessed by a DOJ liaison. 10 complaints, 7 use of force incidents, 3 involving black women over the age of 40. None followed up. Elijah didn't sleep. He didn't blink. He just kept building. Because this wasn't just about his mother anymore. This was about every black woman who'd been cuffed for existing. Every voice that had been silenced by arrogance in a uniform. They thought they could frame Lorraine Bishop. They had no idea they were walking into a courtroom shaped like a battlefield. And they had just handed Elijah the match. The morning sunlight barely pierced the narrow windows of the Boulder precinct as Lorraine Bishop was led, wrists sore, to a small interrogation room. The silence of the station had shifted into something brittle. Officers moved with hushed urgency, whispers bouncing off sterile tile floors, their glances sharp with the knowledge that something had gone terribly off script. The station, that had been so comfortable in its assumptions the night before, was now gripped by the quiet tremor of exposure. Lorraine sat down, her shoulders straight despite the stiffness, her eyes fixed on the scuffed metal table in front of her. Her dignity remained intact, armor forged from decades of quiet resistance. But inside, the weight of everything she had built, her life, her reputation, her silence, was beginning to give way to something heavier, more urgent. Her heart wasn't racing out of fear. It was anticipation, because she knew now that Elijah had found out. And if there was one thing she had taught him, it was how to turn righteous anger into something unstoppable. Down the corridor, Officer Monroe barked into his phone, trying to control a narrative that was already slipping through his fingers. "It's routine," he snapped. "She didn't cooperate. It's a misunderstanding." But even as he spoke, his voice cracked. There were eyes on him now, federal eyes. DOJ agents were on site. Journalists were gathering outside. The air itself had changed. Back in the interrogation room, Lorraine heard the door open softly behind her. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She knew it wasn't Monroe. The energy was different, focused, purposeful. "Elijah," she said simply. Her son stepped into the room, not as a child come to rescue his mother, but as a force entering the arena. His face was composed, his dark eyes steady and brilliant, with a fury held in perfect control. "You okay?" he asked gently. Lorraine nodded once. "They want me small. I refuse." That was all he needed. He pulled out a legal folder, set it on the table, and began. "They violated your civil rights, detained you without probable cause, ignored protocol, and used force without justification. We've got video, 2 witnesses, and now DOJ oversight." Lorraine raised an eyebrow. "That fast?" Elijah gave a thin smile. "They thought you were alone. They underestimated who you raised." By noon, the precinct was no longer theirs. A quiet storm had descended. Officials with badges that bore no local jurisdiction. Briefcases heavy with subpoenas and civil complaints. Digital evidence copied and archived. Monroe passed by Lorraine's room again, this time avoiding her eyes. He felt it. The power he'd once wielded casually had shifted into scrutiny, and there was nowhere left to hide. The press conference outside grew louder. Protesters were now holding up signs with Lorraine's name. Justice for Lorraine Bishop. Wrongfully arrested, proudly unbroken. People who had never met her chanted her name like it was a banner. Inside, Elijah conferred with a federal mediator. "We'll file civil litigation," he said, "but we want disciplinary action now, not later. If Monroe walks out of here with his badge today, it'll send the wrong message." "You have momentum," the mediator agreed. "Public opinion is moving fast." Elijah nodded. "We're not waiting for opinion. We're demanding accountability." Back in her holding room, Lorraine closed her eyes for a moment, hearing the distant chants outside, her son's calm voice down the hall, the rhythmic tapping of agents loading files into laptops. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning, and she was right at the center of it. When the precinct doors finally opened for her, Lorraine didn't rush out. She walked slowly, deliberately, not because she was tired, but because every step was a statement. Her wrists were still marked from the cuffs, her blouse slightly wrinkled from the long night, but her gaze? Unshakable. The reporters swarmed, but Elijah raised a firm hand. "No comments today. There will be time for that. Right now, she's going home." But Lorraine stopped, just for a moment. She turned toward the crowd, her voice clear, calm. "I was arrested for existing, for asking questions, for trusting a system that once promised me protection. But I am not a victim. I am not a headline. I am a mother, a nurse, a citizen, and I will be seen." The applause was instant, thunderous, but she didn't linger in it. She walked forward, past the cameras, past the chanting signs, back into the arms of her family, into a car that would take her home, but not away. She would not disappear. That night, Elijah released a public statement. It outlined the full list of violations, the video evidence, the prior complaints against Monroe and Reese, and it ended with a promise. There will be consequences, and if the city of Boulder refuses to deliver them, we will. Social media caught fire. Local officials scrambled to draft responses. Civil rights organizations offered support. The Boulder Police Department suspended Monroe and launched a formal internal investigation, not out of remorse, but fear. Lorraine watched it all quietly from her living room. She didn't feel triumphant, not yet, but she felt something deeper. The first breath of justice, rising slowly after decades of silence. And somewhere in the quiet hum of her home, Elijah sat beside her, reviewing briefs, drafting motions, already preparing for the next battle. Because they had tried to erase a woman whose legacy was carved into every patient she had cared for, every son she had raised, every injustice she had quietly endured. They thought they could frame her. But now, they were the ones being exposed. And the fight had only just begun. The days that followed Lorraine Bishop's release didn't feel like freedom. They felt like the eye of a storm, eerily quiet, but charged with the weight of everything yet to come. Inside her home, she sat surrounded by stacks of documents, legal notes, and her own thoughts, all competing for her attention. But she wasn't overwhelmed. She was focused. She had spent her entire life showing up for others, patients, co-workers, her son. Now it was time to show up for herself, and for every unseen person her case now symbolized. Elijah had transformed her living room into a makeshift war room. Laptops were open, whiteboards filled with timelines and citations. But the real work, the heart of it, was in the quiet conversations he had with her each morning over coffee. That was where the strategy was born, not in courtrooms, but between mother and son, two generations forged by the same fire. "I need you to be ready," Elijah said one morning, looking at her over the rim of his cup. "Once we file this lawsuit, the blowback won't just come from the department. It'll come from everywhere. They'll drag your name through the mud. They'll try to find ways to discredit you." Lorraine didn't hesitate. "Let them dig. I've buried nothing." Elijah paused. That answer wasn't just brave, it was unshakable. He'd always known his mother was resilient, but now he saw the steel in her bones. And it gave him more resolve than ever. The lawsuit, when it dropped, hit like a bomb. Civil rights violation, wrongful arrest, racial discrimination, abuse of authority. It wasn't just against Officers Monroe and Reese. It implicated their entire chain of command. And perhaps most damning of all, it named specific prior complaints that had been ignored, swept under administrative rugs, or outright erased from internal records. The city of Boulder was suddenly under a spotlight that no press team could spin away. Local media turned national within 48 hours. Lorraine's face, calm, composed, dignified, was plastered across news broadcasts, not as a victim, but as a challenger to the machinery of bias that had operated unchecked for decades. The city responded the way most cities do when cornered, with denial dressed up as diplomacy. The mayor held a press conference praising the dedication of our police force, while simultaneously promising a thorough, objective investigation. No apologies, no accountability, just deflection. But the public wasn't buying it this time. What Monroe and Reese had underestimated, what the entire department failed to see, was how different the world had become. This wasn't a story they could suffocate behind procedural jargon. People were watching. People were sharing. And more importantly, people were speaking up. A retired school teacher from Lorraine's old neighborhood came forward with her own account. A wrongful search warrant served on her home 10 years ago. Then a high school student posted a video showing Officer Monroe shoving him during a peaceful protest in 2020. A former officer, anonymous for now, leaked internal memos showing pressure to keep stats high on certain neighborhoods. The cracks had become fractures. The system was bleeding its secrets into the open. Still, Lorraine didn't gloat. Her anger was real, but so was her grief. Not just for herself, but for all the stories she now carried like sacred weight. Every new voice that joined her cause didn't feel like validation. It felt like responsibility. They were trusting her to be loud when they couldn't be. And Lorraine Bishop had never been one to let anyone down. As the legal proceedings unfolded, Elijah arranged a community forum at a historic black church in Denver. Lorraine was hesitant at first. She wasn't a speaker. She was a nurse. Her battles were usually fought in whispers and quiet endurance, not from pulpits. But the night of the forum, something shifted. The room was packed, standing room only. People from all walks of life, young activists, elders in Sunday hats, reporters scribbling in the back pews, had shown up not for spectacle, but for something real. When Lorraine finally stood to speak, her voice was low at first, uncertain. But as she shared the night of her arrest, the way the manager had looked at her, the sound of the cuffs snapping shut, the silence of the officers who knew better and said nothing. Her voice grew stronger, not theatrical, just true. They didn't see a nurse, she said, her voice clear now. They didn't see a woman who'd saved lives, or a mother who worked double shifts during the pandemic. They saw a threat, and they acted accordingly. The room was still. You could hear someone breathing 3 rows away. Lorraine paused, then added, "But I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because silence is what they've always counted on, and I won't give them mine." The applause was not polite. It was thunderous, defiant, a release. And in that moment, Lorraine realized something profound. This wasn't about whether or not she won the case. This was about awakening, about making noise in a place designed to quiet people like her. That night, after the forum, Elijah sat beside her in the car. "You were incredible," he said quietly. She looked at him and smiled. Not a wide smile, but a knowing one. "I was honest. That's enough." In the days that followed, more support poured in. National civil rights groups offered amicus briefs. A documentary crew requested access to film her story. A state legislator proposed a bill requiring body cam transparency and mandatory bias training. The ripple effect had begun. And though the outcome of the lawsuit was still uncertain, one thing was now crystal clear. Lorraine Bishop had become something bigger than her own pain. She was a mirror held up to a system that could no longer pretend to be blind. And that mirror wasn't going away anytime soon. The morning Lorraine Bishop walked into the courthouse for the final verdict, the sky was overcast, but still held a strange kind of promise. It had been months of hearings, headlines, and harrowing memories brought to life again and again under cross-examination. Every step to this point had been heavy, but today the weight felt different. Not gone, but shifting, transforming. Inside the courtroom, the air was dense with anticipation. People sat in rigid silence, waiting for the final word. Lorraine didn't look at Officers Monroe and Reese, seated stiffly at the defense table with their lawyers. She had spent enough energy reading their expressions. Now, she only wanted to hear one truth confirmed, that what was done to her mattered, that the law could finally say it out loud. The jury entered, each face unreadable. When the foreman rose and announced the verdict, guilty on multiple counts of civil rights violations and abuse of power, there was no eruption, no cheers, only the exhale of dozens of people holding their breath for far too long. Lorraine didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just nodded once, deeply, as though confirming something she had always known would be true, if only the world would finally catch up. Later, outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, their questions fast and relentless. But Lorraine didn't answer them. She turned to Elijah, who stood beside her in his suit, exhausted but proud, and said, "Let's go home." Back at the house, the quiet was almost jarring. Elijah poured 2 glasses of water and sat with her on the porch. The birds chirped as if it were any other afternoon, but everything had changed. Lorraine sipped her drink slowly, then whispered, "I didn't think I'd feel peace. But maybe this is what peace actually looks like. Not fanfare, not celebration, just the absence of fear." Elijah nodded, his voice low. "You gave people something to believe in, Mom. Not just justice. You gave them proof that standing up doesn't have to end in silence." Lorraine stared out at the neighborhood. Kids were riding bikes. A neighbor watered his garden. Normalcy. But now, it lived alongside something else. Hope. She hadn't just stood for herself. She had built a bridge for others to walk across. And while she knew this wasn't the end, there would always be more to fight for. She also knew something else. The system hadn't broken her. It had tried, but she was still here, whole, seen, and unshakably free. Her voice, so often unheard in a room full of assumptions, had changed something real. And for the first time in a very long time, she believed in tomorrow. Lorraine Bishop's story wasn't just about one woman caught in the machinery of racial injustice. It was about what happens when a person dares to reclaim their voice in a system designed to silence them. From a late-night pharmacy stop in Boulder to the blistering spotlight of national headlines, Lorraine's path was paved with humiliation, resistance, and ultimately, a fierce reclaiming of dignity. What began as an ordinary moment turned into an extraordinary movement, not because Lorraine set out to be a symbol, but because she refused to be reduced to one more forgotten statistic. She was a nurse, a mother, a daughter, a black woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. And when the world turned against her, when officers assumed guilt before innocence, when her rights were trampled under the guise of protocol, she did not crumble. Lorraine stood tall, unyielding. With each court appearance, every interview, and every night she chose to rise rather than retreat, she ignited a fire in people who had long stopped believing justice was possible. Her courage inspired those who had once whispered their trauma to speak it aloud. Her strength reminded us that silence is not peace, and compliance is not the same as justice. It took more than one verdict to shake the system, but Lorraine's unwavering stand cracked it open just wide enough for light to get in. And once that light entered, it became impossible to ignore the truth any longer. The lesson we carry from Lorraine's journey is both simple and profound. Do not let the world define your worth. Whether you're facing injustice in your workplace, your community, or your everyday life, know this: your voice has power. Your truth matters. And when you stand for it, no matter how small the step, you're already building change. Apply this lesson wherever you are. Speak up in the face of casual racism. Stand beside someone being mistreated. Educate those around you. And above all, never underestimate the ripple effect one act of courage can have. Because it's not just about changing the system. It's about changing hearts. One conversation, one story, one stand at a time. If Lorraine's story moved you, if it opened your eyes or stirred something deep within you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Stories of resistance, resilience, and real people changing the world in quiet, powerful ways. Together, we can keep pushing forward. Together, we can keep telling the truth. And together, we can make sure voices like Lorraine's are never silenced again.